we saw a lot of people. There was a wide kind of location casting people around the United States. And out of Dallas, we got a picture of this guy. He walked in. It's Lou Diamond Phillips. He's a big, tall guy. And he starts reading Bob. And, he just, it didn't work. It didn't click. Luis, who's got a great nose, he goes, you know what? I know this sounds crazy, but I think he could play Richie. So Luis calls in. He said, Lou, listen, this is a movie called La Bamba about a guy named Richie Valens. We'd like you to read for that role. And Lou goes, what? I'm Bob. I'm reading for Bob. I said, yeah, we know. Come back tomorrow and let's see what you can do. And he came back, he read it, and we looked at each other, and Luis said, that's my Richie.
Welcome to More Than a Movie, a podcast that gives you a behind-the-scenes look at your favorite movies. I'm your host, Alex Fumero. Last season, we did a deep dive on American Me. This season, I'll focus on a different movie each episode, feature interviews with the biggest actors, directors, writers, and producers behind them, and tap into the history of Latinos in film. There's a few schools of thought in Hollywood when it comes to improving diversity in front of and behind the camera. One school says, who cares, basically? May the best man win the job. And in that case, it usually is a man. They're usually white, straight, and cis, and it's not because they're the best at the job. The second school says, only X people can tell X stories. If you're black, only you can tell black stories. If you're Latino, only you can. This strategy, which has been the dominant strategy for the last 10 years or so, works some of the time, as executives are terrified of being accused of prejudice. But it hasn't made the kind of impact on the numbers some had hoped for. Not only does that start to get into some weird territory when it comes to how people want to identify versus how they're seen, but it's also wholly impractical. Hollywood is first and foremost a business, and that business abhors risk. So taking a chance on a first-time filmmaker or an unknown actor scares the shit out of the powers that be. And unfortunately, the people with the most experience, the least risky people, tend to not be marginalized people. So the cycle of white guys continues. There's a third school of thought, however, which I'll call the ally model. The ally model essentially requires a benevolent white straight male cis person, usually, who has clout and a desire to tell a good story that happens to feature a person or people who are not like them. To use their clout and influence, not only to get that story made, but to help marginalized people get opportunities they otherwise wouldn't. You've seen this model at work with people like Brad Pitt, who produced 2 Academy Award-winning black films in Moonlight and 12 Years a Slave. Or even Steven Spielberg, committing to casting actual Latinos and not some Greek guy in brownface in the remake of West Side Story. Unfortunately, these examples are few and far between. But today, I have with me someone who has done this multiple times over his career. Producer and director Taylor Hackford, who coming off of a massive box office hit in An Officer and a Gentleman, decided to use his heat, his political capital in Hollywood, to make a film about a relatively forgotten but critically important character in rock and roll and Latino history, Richie Valens. And instead of directing it himself, he backed Luis Valdez, a Chicano legend in the theater world, but someone who the studios hesitated to give a big budget to for the big screen. First of all, Taylor Hackford, thank you so much for being here with us. This is a podcast dedicated to Latino movies. You are not Latino, but a lot of people may not realize that you're a SoCal boy. You were born in Santa Barbara, California. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Taylor Hackford as a kid and the kind of community he grew up around.
Well, my mother, I was raised, I was a single mother. She was a waitress. She worked in, restaurants around Santa Barbara. And when I was really young, she couldn't afford daycare. So I went and I would hang in the kitchen. And, the dishwashers, the busboys, all of the people were Latino. So they spoke Spanish all the time. So I somehow got this language in my head. And, when I grew up, I was working class. I know my mother was a waitress and a lot of my friends were Chicanos. And that's just kind of my background. So I felt an affinity, and that kind of came into fore later on when I went to LA.
Right. And a lot of people don't think about the fact that Santa Barbara has like a working class section because you just associate it with these grand Spanish style mansions and all the rest of it. But a lot of your friends growing up were Chicano. And I wonder, we're here to talk about the movie La Bamba. I think you were about 12, 13 when that song comes out. Do you remember when that song came out and the impact that it had on your friends and on you and on that community?
Of course. It was on Top 40 radio. It was a rock and roll song. Richie Valens basically took a traditional Mexican folk song and put a rock and roll beat to it and a rock and roll guitar. And it's his arrangement of La Bamba that's so important because, you got a Top 40 radio. When do you have a song in Spanish get into the top 10? It doesn't happen. So it was groundbreaking, and it was not like, oh, gee, I'm political. No, man, it was just it was a great rock and roll song. It was part of your culture as a teenager in California.
Yeah. And you didn't in those days, but you speak Spanish now, right? You did.
Claro que sí.
Claro que sí. Did that upbringing, that experience inspire you to go to the Peace Corps, go to Bolivia and learn Spanish? You seem to have quite an affinity for Latin culture. And so I'm curious, what kind of fuels that for you?
When I went to college, I went to college in Los Angeles. I went to USC, but it was Vietnam. I graduated and I joined the Peace Corps. And if we're going to join the Peace Corps, the whole idea was, why not go someplace where you could learn Spanish and use it later. My experience in Bolivia was fascinating. And, obviously I got much more out of it than the Bolivians. But as an American, it's very, very valuable to kind of encounter and understand the way the majority of the world lives. So it was a big experience for me. And I did learn Spanish there. That whole experience was a life changer for me. You go live in the third world, you live with people who are not blessed with all the stuff that you had as somebody who grew up in America. And so now you can never think of the world in the same way.
That's really interesting. It makes you sort of question what America is. And so this sort of redefines like the place that you grew up, and you come back and you work in public television and you start getting into the music scene, right? You start working on some music programming, no?
Two things, yeah. I'm a child of rock and roll. Uh-huh. So I grew up with rock and roll, and I taught a history of rock and roll class at the university. At that time, there was no uninterrupted popular music or rock and roll on television. Anyway, you're going back to the 60s. I went in and started doing journalism and did, the public TV station. We didn't have lots of money like the commercial stations, but we did have equipment, and we went out and covered the community. So, the guy who I worked for was Mexican. His name was Eddie Moreno. Mm-hmm. And Eddie Moreno was a serious journalist. He really cared about journalism, and he imbued that in me. But also because he was Mexican and Latino, he was interested in what was happening in LA. I came back from the Peace Corps in 1969. I started working in the mailroom of KCET. Eddie gave me a shot. And so we started covering East Los Angeles. I was a reporter. I was covering it. I covered some really interesting things. The thing that was great for me about KCET, the public television station, is that it was my film school. Yeah. I didn't go to film school. I went to Peace Corps, came out. And the great thing that I had is air dates. I had to get something done and put it on the air. It's like in film school, you got one project a semester. I had it every week, 4 times a week. So in the daytime, I worked as a journalist. At night, I would do music shows.
Yeah.
It was great.
How so?
Once I got out of the mailroom and I started being a producer and a reporter, there was a friend named Jesus Trevino. He was a producer there and a really smart guy. Mm-hmm. And he was Chicano. He was doing reporting I mean, Eddie Moreno and I were going out and doing this, but Jesus was doing his own thing. And, we became really good friends. And I started hanging with him and seeing, he did a show. Well, there's one thing that I think is important, which is to do with La Bamba we're talking about. When I was training for the Peace Corps, I was training at Fresno State up in the middle of California.
Mm-hmm.
And we went out for a field trip. And we went to a place called Del Rey, where Cesar Chavez was organizing the farm workers. And the theater political arm of Cesar Chavez's movement was the Teatro Campesino.
That's right.
And I went there. I spent 2 days there. And I met Luis Valdez when I was like 22.
Luis Valdez, for those who don't know, as I mentioned earlier, was and is a legend in the world of Latino theater. Aside from being an organizer in the fields with Cesar Chavez, he also created a play called Zoot Suit that launched or inspired the careers of dozens of Latino and Chicano actors that are still working today, including the subject of our entire season 1, Edward James Olmos. So it's a big deal and shows that he's a real motherfucker that Taylor was even fucking with Luis to begin with.
And I was training for the Peace Corps. And here's this guy who, he was tough. I mean, Luis is tough. And he was taking his love of theater and doing agitprop theater in the fields with farm workers and against the growers. And listen, the growers were not taking it nicely. At night, there were people, coming by and shooting, Luis was toughened by the politics of the fields. And he was very close to Cesar Chavez. So I met, it wasn't for very long, a couple of days that I hung there, but I met this guy and I went, wow, this is a smart, dedicated, committed, political guy and also an artist.
Yeah.
So that was an important part. Then when I was at KCET later, Jesus Trevino, he was a journalist and a documentary filmmaker, but he wanted to do a music show with a young artist named Daniel Valdez. He was the younger brother of Luis. And he did this show called America de los Indios. And he wrote these songs. He's a singer, guitar player, and unbelievably talented. And I saw this show and I went, whoa, this guy is great. And Danny and I, became really close friends. I mean, Danny and I bonded and we were like hermanos. And we just hung and, would talk about things and so on. And Danny was so talented. I remember one night we were over at a friend's house and we were drinking beers and talking and said, we should do a film about Richie Valens, because Richie Valens is Chicano. He had this great voice. You got a voice as good as his. And this whole story could be really cool. So Danny and I are like, I'm going to be the filmmaker. You're going to be the star. And we're going to do this film. Of course, neither one of us had a pot to piss in. we're like nobodies.
Right.
And nothing came of it. But there was a desire and a sense that Danny was inspiring me and had all the talent to do it. Well, cut 10 years later. All right. I go and I make my first feature called The Idolmaker. And then I made my second feature called An Officer and a Gentleman, which was a huge international hit. And all of a sudden, my stock in Hollywood, because when you do a hit movie, people go, Taylor, who?
Yeah.
What? That kind of thing. I get a phone call. It's Danny. And Danny says, hey, I got 2 words for you. Richie Valens. Now's the time. And he was right. But the problem is, when I first met Danny, he was a young punk like I was. 10 years later, he's in his 30s. He's not really right for Richie anymore.
Right.
But it was Danny Valdez and I who developed La Bamba. We went to Hollister, and then we went to Watsonville, and we met Connie Valenzuela, and we got the rights to Richie's life. Talk about an interesting thing,
The other thing that's super interesting is this commercial you're about to hear. I have no idea what it is, and they put it in after, but trust me, it's interesting. Welcome back to More Than a Movie. I'm your host, Alex Fumero. In a later episode this season, you'll hear our interview with Luis Valdez about his work on La Bamba and Zoot Suit. And when we spoke to him, he told us about meeting Taylor Hackford for the first time. Here's Taylor's version of that story. So we spoke to Luis Valdez for a while, and he told us, we talked to him about Zoot Suit and obviously developing that. He talked about meeting you when you came to visit the United Farm Workers and Teatro Campesino. And he talked about how he and Danny would talk about La Bamba also. And, this is like a common thing. Everybody always wonders how projects come to be. And people just it's kind of circulates or whatever. But
well, the important thing here is you understand, and I understand. Luis Valdez is a great artist.
Yeah.
Luis Valdez is La Bamba,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yes. But in terms of the chronology, Danny and I talked about it a long time before.
Yeah.
Luis is an intellectual. He's international theater. He's this and that. He's a heavyweight. So Danny and I were talking. We got the rights from Connie, and now it's a question of, all right, we got the rights, but we're going to do the film. I said we should go to your brother.
Yeah,
because fun. He Zoot Suit. Luis defined Chicano theater in California. He's an important, I think, intellectual mind.
Yeah.
So Danny goes, but see, it's the younger brother, older brother. Danny goes, oh, no, Luis is never going to do this. I said, why? He goes, no, he's not going to do it because he's too elevated. He's got his head in the clouds. He's intellectual. I said, Luis Valdez has spent his life defining the Chicano experience on the stage in California. This is Richie Valens, man. This is a kid, a working class kid who has a #1 hit in America. So we go to Luis, and he kind of goes, I don't know. I know about Richie. And the point is that we convinced Luis to write the screenplay.
And how do you go about that? This is more of a producer question, right? Your career is unique, and you are unique in that, some projects you're like, this is mine to direct. And then other projects you're like, no, I really am passionate about this. I want to produce it, but there's other folks who are the right kind of voice or vehicle for it. So you go to a guy like Luis Valdez, who's immensely talented, who is, like you said, the kind of the definitive voice of Latino theater, and then, who has made this kind of foray into film through Zoot Suit, which was kind of like a mix between a feature and the filming of a live stage production, right? And how do you go, this is a two-part question. We'll start with the first part, which is, how do you convince Luis? And then later, how do you convince the studio system that's typically very conservative that this guy is the right guy for this movie?
Well, this is how it came about. Once I kind of said to Luis, one, you got the freedom to tell this story. It's a great story. And it's what you've been doing your whole life after San Jose State and going through talking about Latinos busting into the American culture. Richie Valens did it. So he got it. But then, we realized I had a deal at Columbia Pictures. They wanted me after An Officer and Gentleman. I went there. I made Against All Odds. I was doing films for them.
What does that mean, you have a deal in those days, right? Like, does that mean you have green light power, or like what is?
No,
right?
No. You don't have green light power. But what you do is that they give you money to have an office, and you hire development people, and you go out and you develop material. Because that's the way it used to work. You would go out and you would, if you were inspired by something and you had success, they said, well, I'll take a roll of the dice with this guy. And I went out and I developed La Bamba. And the guy who ran, this is really important, the guy who ran Columbia Pictures was a guy named Guy McElwain. And he was the president of production. He had grown up as a minor league baseball pitcher. He was from California. He grew up, he remembered La Bamba. And I had a good relationship with him. I said, I'm going to develop this film about La Bamba. Remember that song? Oh, yeah, man. That was a great idea. I said, well, it's going to be two things. It's going to be inexpensive. Two, it's going to be a Latino film, which the whole Hollywood doesn't deal with. I said, there's a huge population out there, gigantic. And Hollywood is interested in going out and selling tickets. And I said, there's a whole audience you're missing. He said, what? I said, Latinos. They go to movies all the time. Nothing is made for them. This is the story of their life, Richie Valens. So he said, go ahead and develop it. So when I went to Luis, And I convinced him, I said, hey, man, I'm going to be the Trojan horse here. We're going to go in and we're going to get this film made because I've got a deal and you're going to do the script. I didn't promise him that he was going to direct. I said, I want you to write the script, but I'm not going to tell you what to write. I have huge respect for you. I know that this means something to you. Go write it. And Luis said yes. Nothing can get done unless you write a good script. Luis killed it. He did this great story because he knew he's writing about his life.
Yeah.
He wrote this script about Richie and Richie's family and about Bob, his brother, an important role because he's the oldest. He's the guy, but he's really talented artist, but he's bashing up against white culture. And, he's a biker. He's thrown in jail. Bob, when I met him, it was like, you had this beautiful story about Richie, but everybody that talked about Richie, it was like, Richie's so wonderful. His mother had this altar for him in her living room. It's like, he's the perfect guy. Then we met Bob and go, oh, okay, well, now we're in good shape because you got the good brother and the bad brother. And that always says an interesting story with a mother trying to keep him, in the middle. And Luis saw that and he wrote a fabulous script. Well, people in the movie business understand a good script when they see it. So I turned the script in. Luis has done it. And they go, wow, this is great. Now, who's going to direct it? I said, Luis Valdez is going to direct it. They said, what? You didn't tell us that. I said, listen, the guy's a director. He did Zoot Suit. He is a substantial guy. And I think he needs the shot. And let me say this. You see that you like this script. You know why you like it? It's really beautifully done, but it also is a voice in it, and the voices of Chicano culture. And you need a director who understands what's on the page and even more. And I said, I'll produce the movie and I'll back Luis up, but that doesn't mean I'm going to direct the movie. I'm not. He's got to direct it. And believe me, he's that strong. So we made this partnership, and Guy McElwain at Columbia said, you're right. Okay, go. We had $3.5 million that we made La Bamba with. And at the time it was, that's still a lot more money than most people had at the time. Anyway, my point at that point was just to back Luis up. When I say that, I mean back him up in the sense of his vision in the script, his vision in the film, and just make sure he's protected.
Well, I'm curious on that point because, unfortunately, and this is a big reason why I wanted to talk to you, Taylor, because I consider you a very important figure in the kind of recent history of Latino film. And that is because Latinos have unfortunately not had that many allies outside of Latinos really pushing for their stories. And so I'm curious so some of the things that you did in the 80s with this film, I think those learnings still apply to what's going on today because we really haven't come as nearly as far as you would have thought, from La Bamba. And so I'm wondering when you're selling a Luis Valdez, right? Like I'm sure, you were aware of all the, beyond just the farm worker stuff. But then when you're talking to the studio execs, are those the kinds of experiences that you, like, how do you sell them on Luis? Are those the types of experiences you're bringing to them? Or what is it that they respond to that makes them go, okay, Taylor, you're right. Luis is the guy. How do you position him?
No, you have a good relationship. Guy McElwain and I were close, number one. Number two, I made him money.
Yeah.
When you're head of a studio and they said, okay, you make a film, I go out and I make him money, then he feels like, I can trust this guy. And I said to him, listen, this is smart. There's a big audience. Nobody knew it, by the way.
Yeah.
I said, there's a big audience here. These people aren't stupid. It's an audience that nobody is covering. You can do it. I'll make sure the film is done cheaply enough that it's not going to kill you, number one. Number two, if we're really going to speak to that audience, you think a Gavacho can do it? I mean, pardon me. In reality, in senses, you need something authentic. And you're reading a script that is authentic. You're reading a script written by a guy who knows what he's talking about, and you love the script. Well, he can direct this movie. He can direct actors. He's directed actors on stage. He comes out of the theater. Mike Nichols came out of the theater.
Yeah.
Who gave him a shot to direct a movie? And I'm going to be there. I won't be directing the movie, Guy. Understand it. I'm not doing it because I can direct the movie. I direct movies. I'm going to be a producer, a good producer. So if Luis needs something, I'm going to be there. And in one area, I was able to help because I shot a lot of music. Remember, back at KCET, I shot music. Now, Luis had not shot music. He didn't understand. So the musical sequences of La Bamba, he was still in charge of, but I set the cameras, because I knew what to do.
Yeah.
But he still, Lou Diamond Phillips up on stage, it's Luis talking to him, not me. But I did help there. But the reality is, Guy trusted me.
Which is a producer's job, right? Like you're sort of like change hats whenever the director, whoever needs you. It's not like you're stepping on his toes. That's like part of helping him.
No. Hey, listen, I had a lot of respect for Luis. And second of all, Luis he's a man.
Yeah.
He's a tough guy.
Yeah.
You don't step on Luis Valdez's toes.
He wouldn't allow it.
He'll kick back.
Yeah.
It was respect though. And I had respect for Luis. He, I think understood that I was there to try to make the best film. And then let's get to the selfish part of it.
Yeah.
I thought, hey, nobody's done this. We can make a great film.
Yeah.
And if we make a great film, we'll sell lots of tickets and we'll have a hit movie.
Yeah.
Now, that's what you do when you produce a movie, right? I mean, I'd bought Richie Valens' catalog from Connie, but it wasn't like a ripoff. I said, Connie, how much money are you making per year? And she told me. I said, if I make this movie, you make 10 times that off the royalties. And I did. And she did. I had a great relationship with La Concha, with Connie Valenzuela.
Who I've heard also is a tough cookie. But
she was amazing.
Yeah. Well, but that touches on 2 points that I think are important to what's going on today. One of those is that it has to be a business, and this is a theme that I think we're seeing over and over again in this podcast. The folks that I'm interviewing who are successful in what they do, who are Latinos or working in the Latino space, diversity initiatives and the kind of like identity politics of it are important, and we need to keep sort of that social conversation going. But Luis said this, money is green, and that's the color that the studios care about. And you really have to make it a business proposition for them. And that seems like something you were keenly aware of from the beginning. But you also did something that I think needs to be highlighted, which is you burned political capital for this, right? When I ask you, how did you get them to accept Luis Valdez? What I'm hearing you say is, I told them I believe in this guy. You believe in me. We have a relationship. You trust me. And I trust him. Without that, nothing is going to change. Right.
Right.
And so, sometimes I'm frustrated. I see great directors make great movies today, and then they have an opportunity to sort of do their darling, the movie people don't want to let them make. And they choose to make a movie about, them being a 13-year-old white kid growing up wherever. And I'm like, this is a lost opportunity. You could have grabbed somebody else. And that is what you did. You came off of directing this and you chose to tell, instead of saying like, I'm going to tell the story about me, growing up in Santa Barbara, you're like, no, Richie fucking Valens. Like, that's the story I want to tell, Right. At the time, were you thinking like, I want to make this like a whole business? Do I want to produce like a slew of Latino movies? Or were you looking at it as like one thing at a time? Like, did you sort of see it as like, this is a business for my company? Or was it just about this film?
No, I think that you got to start somewhere. I mean, La Bamba was the first film I produced outside of directing. I produced and directed my movies, but this was a producing job. And I did it because I believed in it, but I also believed it could be successful. And you know what? It was. Unfortunately, I mean, it is still the highest grossing Latino film in Hollywood history. I mean, but come on. It was what, 30 years ago, 25 years ago? I mean, it should have been, it should have flowed from there. Once Hollywood smelled there's money out there in this community. I mean, we broke a lot of ground. At the time, you know who owned Columbia Pictures? Coca-Cola.
Wow.
And I said, God, if there's anybody who knows how to market to Latinos, it's Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
I mean, they know who drink Coca-Cola
Yeah.
in market. We actually got Coca-Cola to do displays in supermarkets for La Bamba.
Brilliant.
You know, we were marketing. It was great. Secondly, we released, and I don't know too many films in Hollywood that ever was, we did day and date with English and Spanish prints.
Which is so ahead of its time. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
I would say it's ahead of its time, except people don't do it now, but it's like so brilliant.
We did 25% of our business. If that would prove it, we did 25% of our business, and we opened well in Spanish-only prints. That says it all, doesn't it? I mean, 25%. We ended up by making, I think, $55 million domestic. But, you know, at the same time, that was domestic. I was just in the United States for a little $3 million movie.
Mm.
That's a good profit for Columbia Pictures.
But then Taylor Hackford, person who understands Hollywood and has worked in this business for decades, why didn't it keep going? What happened?
Well,
because this happens all the time. Every 10 years, there's some big success, and then it just fizzles. I can't explain it.
It has to do with understanding. You know, it's funny. I said I went and got the rights with Danny. I mean, Luis knows the family, dealt with everybody as well, but we got the rights. And the big deal about going to the rights, when you walk into a woman's house and you walk in and you see in the living room an altar with Richie Valens' face on it and Jesus and the Virgin, there it is. And you realize he died at 17 and a half and she's got this homage. I had to say to her, Jonita, listen, you love your Richie. I understand that. I appreciate Richie. I'm not directing this. We haven't done the script yet. We haven't done anything. But I'm going to make sure it has integrity. And Bob's going to be a character and all those things. But you cannot have control. Okay? You cannot have control because I need to make a great movie. And you love your baby and you're going to say, no. And I can tell you right now, if you don't give me control, this really now came down to she and I. Then, in fact, I'm going to walk out of here. We're not going to do it. And she trusted me. We had this relationship. She trusted me. And I believe I never, ever betrayed Connie Valenzuela. My relationship was to her. Now, Luis's was later on, too. Understand that's an important step because by all rights, when they made Selena, listen, they had Jennifer Lopez. She was fantastic. They had a great story, an incredible story. But you know what? They went and the producer went and went, Selena's father, he has final say. You know, right there, I knew. Yeah. Right there. It's over. They should have killed us. They should have had $100 million movie or $200 million movie because Selena had just died. She was huge. It's dramatic. She's got all these great records out. But the moment you let La Familia, because you know what? Yeah. The Familia says, you can't say that. You can't say this. You can't do this. You can't do this. In La Bamba, we have, Bob takes his younger brother to Tijuana. They go into a whorehouse bar, and that's where Richie hears La Bamba. Yeah. That's where he hears the song. Now, Connie, in the long run, said, fine. But if I said to Connie, I'm going to take Richie down to into a whorehouse in Tijuana, she would have said, absolutely not my Richie. Yeah. But Luis, by the way, Luis did it. Luis put it in the script. He knew how to direct it. He did all those things. Richie still came out of it, sweetest guy in the world. He really does, yeah. But it was real. And he hears La Bamba. And of course, we had Los Lobos on stage doing the original folk version of it. Yeah. And Richie leaves it and goes in. But see, that scene where I went to Connie and said, you got to give me control. That's why Selena did not kill us. Selena, by all rights, should have killed us. But when you saw the film, there was something missing. There was like the father going, oh, you can't say this. Oh, you can't do that. And so everybody kind of went, pardon me. I hope that I don't. No, it's rumored to be the issue with even the most recent series that was done on Netflix where, again, this is rumor, but that they went through 3 different iterations of all of the scripts for the show as a result of the family's involvement. But I guess what my question for you then is, my big
question mark is La Bamba was the success, right? Was this model, is the highest grossing, and yet it did not lead to an explosion of Latino film. It's been 36 years since La Bamba, right? You proved in 1987 that there's a business model for this, right?
Yes.
So then what's the obstacle? What is Hollywood not understanding? And what are we not understanding? What am I as a Latino filmmaker not understanding about, how to make this happen?
I think that this is the great question. I mean, the fact that 36 years later, that La Bamba hasn't been beaten time and time and time again at the box office. It's tragic. It is. I think going back to what we were talking about, you can't leave it to executives. Executives like Guy McElwain could never have made this movie. I mean, they're executives and they're not creative. You know what happened in La Bamba? I got an artist, Luis Valdez, who was strong, had a vision, had a point of view, and was an artist. I was an artist. So I'm supporting him, and I had enough clout to go to the guys at the studio and say, no, stand back. Trust me. All right. You're not going to waste much money, but trust me. And I had final cut. See, Luis didn't have final cut. I had final cut. But so what? I still made his movie.
Yeah.
And he got to make his movie. But the interesting thing was that I, as an artist, understood you got to be tough, but you also have to understand the audience gets it. The audience has a nose, and they smell when it's authentic.
Yeah, they smell bullshit. Yeah.
And I think La Bamba was authentic, and that's why it was successful. I mean, in this instance, I went out on a limb. I basically said, trust me, I'm going to go do this, and you're not going to be hurt badly. But if I fuck up, it's me. You don't have to renew my deal. It's me. I'm backing up Luis Valdez, but what you cannot do is ameliorate this material. Then you really got nothing. So I think that, I'm not patting myself on the back.
No, I mean, I don't want to blow smoke up your ass, Taylor, but I'm telling you, I wish to God more producers were like you today. I mean, it's like, we need this. This is what we need, is somebody to walk into the room and go, I'm putting me on the line for this. So do it.
Right.
I mean, it's necessary. It is that hard to get these movies made that you need that.
Yeah, it is what it is. And I think Luis understood that I was there for him. I was there. And by the way, realize his brother was one of my best friends. Danny, he played Mimo. He played the uncle of Richie in the film. He was the associate producer.
Yeah.
But remember, it all started with he and I having beers talking about him playing Richie.
Well, Luis was very clear. I mean, Luis, one, has an immense amount of respect for you. Two, talked a lot about your sort of background in music also being instrumental. And three, that this movie just wouldn't have gotten made, and Connie would have never given anybody the rights had someone like you not been there to get them and get involved and make it happen, right? So he was pretty clear about all that stuff.
It's the understanding of that, and at the same time, my understanding that as a filmmaker, I was not the right guy to make this movie. Right. I wasn't. And he was. And therefore, my job as a producer is to push and protect, get everybody out of his way and let him make the movie, which he did and did brilliantly.
I am not Taylor Hackford, so I can't protect you, sadly, from this next commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to More Than a Movie. I'm your host, Alex Fumero, and I'm speaking to Taylor Hackford about casting a young, spunky Filipino kid as a Chicano rock icon and why Lou Diamond Phillips was the best choice for the role. So let's talk about Lou Diamond Phillips. How did you happen on Lou Diamond? In today's day and age, people will say, what, you couldn't find one Latino kid that could have sang and danced and done all that. But, the way Luis sort of framed it, I mean, this seemed like you guys cast a pretty wide net and you landed on a guy who today is a pretty famous, has had a pretty big career. So talk me through that casting decision.
Again, my job is to support Luis. And we had a great casting director named Junie Lowry, who was a fabulous casting director. She went on to do a lot of big shows. And we went through the Latin community, but Richie's got to sing, he's got to dance, and we saw a lot of people. There was a wide kind of location casting people around the United States. And out of Dallas, we got a picture of this guy, and he came in for Bob. And he came from Dallas. He came in, he walked in. It's Lou Diamond Phillips. He's a big, tall guy. And he starts reading Bob. And, he just, it didn't work. It didn't click. Luis, who's got a great nose, he goes, you know what? I know this sounds crazy, but I think he could play Richie. And I go, yeah, you may be right. I don't know. He said, why don't we try it? We haven't had any luck so far. So Luis calls Lou back in. He said, Lou, listen, this is a movie called La Bamba about a guy named Richie Valens. We'd like you to read for that role. And Lou goes, what? I'm Bob. I'm reading for Bob. He said, yeah, we know. Well, here's the script. We want you to go home tonight, and we want you to read these pages, these scenes. Come back tomorrow, and let's see what you can do. And he came back, he read it, and we looked at each other, and Louis said, that's my Richie. That's my Richie. That's the way these things work. It changed Lou Diamond Phillips' career, his life. He changed ours. We finally had somebody who worked, right? So these are great casting stories that kind of work. And it's interesting. How things change. We were looking for Bob. We needed a great Bob. Well, a guy came in named Jesse Borrego, who's a fabulous actor. And he was on a TV series called Fame. Right. And again, Luis goes, there he is. That's great. So, again, I'm following what Luis likes. We go, and it had been on for 3 seasons. It was going off. They had 1 episode left. And Jesse was just dancing on that episode. And the producer said, no, he's not free. I called the producer and I said, hey, man, one thing I learned early on, actors, they have such a fucking hard time in life. They never get a chance. This role of Bob Valenzuela in this movie is great. You have 1 left and he's dancing. I'll work about the schedule. Let's do it. The guy says, no, he's not. I thought, you fucking asshole.
What an asshole.
Asshole. You have destroyed this guy's possible career because you know what is hard for, how hard it is for a Latino to get a great role that's not a drug dealer? So he said no. Well, lucky for us, Esai Morales was the next guy that came in through the door. Right. And honestly, Esai was a brilliant Bob. He was fantastic. And you get Lou Diamond Phillips and Esai, they had it. So anyway, the casting process is just as important as the script. And again, this was all under Luis Valdez's guidance. Yeah. He really knew what he was doing.
Well, I think you hit on something that's like core to it, right? Which is that you need somebody who is the sort of filter for authenticity, right? And that's Luis, that's Danny, his brother, who worked with you on the film, right? And then it opens things up a little more. And I'd be curious to know, you've been working in this business a long time, and I think sometimes the perfect can be the enemy of the good. But like when you're casting, you really do have to think about what's going to sell this fucking movie, but like what's going to sell this, right? Do you think sometimes we do ourselves a little bit of a disservice by being too purist about, this person has to be from here? And
yeah, I think so. I mean, I believe I always believe it. I don't care who I'm casting. You give the role to the best actor.
Yeah.
Give the role to the best actor. And if they're really great, they'll make it believable. Esai Morales made you believe he was a Chicano. Yeah. Elizabeth Pena, who's Cuban, made you believe she was a Chicano. On the other hand, we had total authenticity. Listen, I was a producer. The producing job is different than directing.
Yeah.
And, I hired the writer, Danny and I, but I hired his brother.
Yeah.
Luis happened to do a great script that we wouldn't have been able to go forward. None of this would have meant anything if Luis hadn't done it.
Yeah.
Luis then made sure that he was the director because I trusted his nose.
Yeah.
But as a producer, I did have a lot to say. And I think that my feeling for Chicanos, my sense that I grew up with them, that was a sense of respect that you say, I can be part of this, and I'll make sure. I never had to worry about, I got Luis Valdez there. He knows what's real and what's not. He knows what's Chicano and what's not. I'm not sitting there, as a producer going, gee, Luis, I'm not so sure this is. He's lived it. He was it. So that was an important, part of what I was doing. And that's what producing is about. You try to line it up around a subject that I knew, because again, at its core, Ritchie Valens is America. Ritchie Valens is Chicano. It's the Latino culture which infuses this country. And I knew that it was a great story. That's what you do. And I believed it all the way through and tried to make it happen, again, with Luis Valdez.
Well, Taylor Hackford, I think that's a great place to end. I just want to say, I wish my message out there for all you successful non-Latino actors, writers, directors, producers is please be more like Taylor Hackford. And I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we'll go
Great.
From there.
Thanks, Alex.
Next week on More Than a Movie, way before she was giving feminist speeches in Barbie, America Ferrera was giving them as an angsty teenager in the critically acclaimed film Real Women Have Curves. We'll speak to Patricia Cardozo, the director who gave America Ferrera her first starring role on the big screen. More Than a Movie Season 2 was produced by Chloe Tagliagambe with the help of Reynolds Gutierrez and Veronica Hernandez in partnership with iHeart's My Cultura Podcast Network. Hosted by me, Alex Fumero. Edited by Rose Reed and Chloe Tagliagambe with the help of Saida Quevedo. Executive producers are Carmen Graterol, Rose Reed, Isaac Lee, and me, Alex Fumero. Sound design by Gonzalo Messi. Original music by Golden Minds, Darko, and IM. Recorded at JTB Studios and Vaudeville Sound. Our executive producers at iHeart are Giselle Bances and Arlene Santana. For more My Cultura podcasts, listen to the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your favorite shows.